As I try to understand the dramatic changes that we've recently seen in world politics, I keep coming back to two tightly linked concepts: exclusion and inequality. Why are some people so skeptical about the benefits of trade? Why do they think that climate change is not a serious problem, or even that it's happening at all? In my view, it's not because they found a new economic model that refutes comparative advantage. There's just no such model. Similarly, it's not because they have new data that challenges the correlation between the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and average temperatures. There's just no such data. People reject settled science because they feel materially excluded, because they don't think that they were properly consulted and heard, and because they suspect, or in fact know, that policies which are presented as good for everyone are in fact harming their families, their communities, and their loved ones. To be frank, over the past decade, I've often felt that the term just transition was treated in climate discourse as no more than a pious aspiration, or as if the transition would automatically be just because it would secure the long-term future of our planet. Please don't get me wrong. Here at Standard Bank, we are as convinced as ever of the necessity for the transition towards the low-carbon economy. But in order to make sure that this transition actually happens, we at Standard Bank believe that we all have to focus very intently on making sure that the transition is really just, that it is fair, inclusive, and visibly beneficial for all. People want reliable energy that they can afford right now, and they won't sacrifice that for abstractions like the climate or the future. Second, it is becoming increasingly clear that we need to think both about energy systems and about infrastructure more broadly. People want to see large-scale public investment directly making their lives better. Third, we need to build resilience to climate-induced challenges such as extreme weather. People want to see investment making their lives safer. When we say we support a just transition, we've always meant it, both the just part and the transition part. Here's what we mean when we say just. Our focus is unequivocally on driving Africa's growth. We make no apologies. And that means that we support a mix of renewable and transitional projects. We are completely clear that African countries have a right, indeed a duty, to use their fossil fuels, to lift themselves out of poverty, a point explicitly recognized in the Paris Agreement. Take ECOP. Yes, there are environmental costs, but these are being minimized. And the net effect on the project is worth it, now and into the future, considering all the facts, which include that East Africa has a right to economic development and that people need energy, they need income, and a healthy and pleasant place to live. Furthermore, ECOP is an important and wholly credible element of Total's own net zero transition plan, providing both relatively low carbon energy and the revenue that they need to make their own transition. And here's what we mean at Standard Bank when we refer to transition. Earlier this year, we updated our climate policy and restated our commitment to continue to reduce the share of our balance sheet that supports upstream oil and gas. We set a new and larger target for sustainable finance. We will mobilize more than 450 billion rand of sustainable finance by 2028. We are already more than halfway to achieving this target, and we are unwavering in our commitment to achieve net zero in our portfolio by 2050.
Africa faces this dual challenge of an urgent need to power its growing economies and populations, but at the same time building a sustainable and climate resilient future. At Standard Bank, we are deeply committed to driving Africa's growth by financing and investing in infrastructure and energy in a way that supports access and security, but also in a way that balances the need to mitigate the impact of climate change. So in this regard, as Sim alluded to earlier, in 2022, we launched our climate policy, which commits us to a net zero pathway by 2050, but also set some fairly ambitious targets at 450 billion by 2028 in terms of sustainable financing across green, social, and transition eligible activities. The climate change impacts that you're experiencing on the ground in some of these markets like Zambia, which are exacerbated by the droughts and the climate change that we see.
So last year and already 2019, we suffered the first drought. Then immediately last year, there was a very significant drought, which effectively left the power system extremely unstable. So much so that not only was there load shedding, which is just as business as usual during drought, but we actually were almost witnessing the entire system collapse. So with significant, the only way to overcome that was through energy imports and through cross-border integrated market that exists, which is the Southern African Power Pool. So what we packaged together with Standard Bank, and it was, as Helen said, a very innovative project, and really credit goes to the bank for following suit and for looking at trading models in that level of detail. But what we managed to put together in collaboration with Eskom towards the end of last year is to ensure that we bring in 10% of total energy capacity of Zambia for the next 5 months. And that not only left the grid stable, but also facilitated the ability for some of the increased mining output and agricultural output to continue, them being the key ingredients for GDP overall growth of the country. So notwithstanding IMF's significant projection on decrease of GDP growth in Zambia in June 2024, last year from 5.8% to 2.4%, actually the GDP growth reached 5.9%, almost 6% this year. Why? Because we managed to stabilize the grid, which managed to facilitate not only through cross-border imports, but renewable energy projects that we help deliver on the ground, additional capacity to make sure that those two key industries are kept whole. Because otherwise the overall economic would be not only climate catastrophe, but economic catastrophe as a whole.
I think the one thing that we've been successfully doing is to see energy security, energy efficiency, cost competitiveness, and the ability for us to see a significant shift in the way that we produce energy through a just mechanism as an integrated approach. And I think through the work that we've done, we've been able to do that, and may just by use of examples. I mean, when we sort of did the changes to the Electricity Regulatory Act and the Schedule 2 that allowed for registration of utility scale generation projects, and of course embedded that now into the subsequent era that came into effect in 1st of January 2025. The more important part was that you were not only producing for own use, you were producing for multiple off-takers that was not Eskom. And I think that was fairly significant. When we track the projects that are there, in actual fact, businesses take decisions on what would be the lowest sort of cost of what generation output. So there's choices. The law doesn't say you got to build this or that. You make choices around the generation capacity. And we retracked the 22.5 gigawatts of electricity generation. 95% of that is renewable energy. So businesses consciously decide to invest in those decisions because of sustainability reasons, because of cost competitiveness, because of efficiency, and because they see themselves in the future growing and having to get export markets, and these are important decisions that they do take. So the choice is not just, it's energy security versus that. I think that what we have seen is integration of that. And so, of course, there are trade-offs in this conversation, so I put it in a nice way. but in actual fact, there are always this sort of trade-offs that are there.
I think let's start off with understanding what we mean by the energy trilemma. So it's really the challenge of simultaneously achieving three critical but often competing goals, which is energy security, it's energy equity and inclusion and affordability, and then it's environmental sustainability. And that's a difficult choice, right? We have the choice as a country. Every country in the continent makes different choices. They have different resource bases and different contexts in which they make those decisions. But I think for us, living in the trenches for doing this for the last 20 years, we're actually seeing a shape shift away from that trilemma, actually to more of a, what I'd like to say, a reinforcing convergence of those factors. And that's driven largely by the new technologies and business models that we see, as part of the sort of green climate revolution. And it really is a revolution. I'll get onto the revolution in a second, especially from a solar point of view. So today, unlike some of the facts that you might have heard earlier, my facts are different. And my facts are today, solar and wind is undoubtedly the most affordable form of energy that is deployed globally and on the continent. The intermittency issues are rapidly being solved with new technologies and battery energy storage systems. And those price points now you'll see from dispatchable power that's gone out in South Africa being least cost that outcompetes equivalent spinning reserve fossil fuels, etc. So we are seeing that every day, and we're seeing it actually increasing. The prices are getting lower and so increasing in momentum. So we see that the sort of other part to that is that we are terrible at transitioning. We've got a bad transition track record for all the reasons. Human behavior, we resist change, sunk capital, strategic interest driven by profit. And as Mark Twain said, the Nile ain't just the biggest river in Egypt. So we really are still stuck with sometimes medieval institutions, but with godlike technology. And we really have the opportunity to overcome any of those risks. I'll get into the risks in a second. But I just want to talk about China very briefly. There is no two ways about it that China has made those strategic decisions to embrace the green economy and to lead this revolution because they see it as a strategic advantage. They've done their numbers, they've done their sums. This is not misinformation or misguided decision. They developed about 300 gigawatts last year, unprecedented year of the total global 600 odd gigawatts. And yes, they still are developing coal. But according to multiple sources, I think China is getting increasingly close to peak emissions, where I believe the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world will follow.
IEA is telling us that in 2024, global spending on energy or investments hit $2 trillion. But what they also tell us is that only 3% of this $2 trillion came to Africa, which is quite astonishing. And I'm sure you would have heard earlier, we only get 3% of this 2 trillion, but we know that 1 in 2 people do not have access to electricity. We also know that more than 500,000 women and children died prematurely on the continent due to lack of access to clean cooking. So, I mean, this is the situation. We're sitting with $85 billion investment gap on the continent. And infrastructure South Africa, within South Africa, obviously is seeking to close this infrastructure investment gap. And if I can just summate in a nutshell, this is being achieved really through three mechanisms. One is providing limited fiscal project preparation funding to infrastructure projects. The second, given that we are providing limited fiscal funding, is to then attract non-fiscal funding from other actors to the infrastructure projects. And then the third really is expediting permitting and licensing of projects. So making sure that once the project is there, it's getting to a financial close and getting to commercial operation. So just to touch briefly in terms of the project preparation methodology which we utilize. So we have adopted and locally adapted the 5-case model from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority in the UK. And really this is how you get a project from the planning phases up through to bankability. And essentially this 5-case model has got 5 key components. One is the strategic case. So it's really the case for change or the rationale. Why should this project exist? It's the economic case. It's the commercial case, which is really speaking to, can you strike a credible commercial deal? Can you put the contracts in place to make this project to happen? It is the financial case, as well as the management case, which is really speaking to, do you have the requisite institutional capacity and capability to be able to deliver the project?